All right, ready to dive into a new deep dive with me? This one, you might not have heard of this one before.
Oh, this one's going to be a good one.
This one's a good one. We're going to be talking about HMPV.
HMPV.
Yeah. Human Metapneumovirus.
Okay. I've heard of that one.
So it's a respiratory virus, but like it can get kind of serious, especially if you're, younger or older, or if your immune system's not great.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we're going to talk about kind of why people don't really know about it, even though it's been around for a long time.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was officially discovered in 2001, pretty recently, but research shows it's actually been around for much longer, probably decades.
Wow.
Yeah.
So imagine, right, how many people were sick and they just thought it was a cold or the flu or something like that.
Exactly. Who knows how many people have had it and just never knew.
Crazy. So how come it's so hard to tell if you have it?
Well, the symptoms are really similar to a lot of other respiratory illnesses. Runny nose, coughing, sore throat, maybe a fever, stuff like that.
So it could be a cold or the flu or even COVID.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a chameleon, It blends right in.
So how do you know if you have it or not?
Well, honestly, it often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
Unless you specifically get a test for it, it's almost impossible to tell for sure.
So are doctors testing for it, or is it just kind of slipping through the cracks?
It's definitely slipping through the cracks sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not practical to test everybody for everything,
Yeah.
But it's important to consider HMPV if you're really sick or if you're in a high-risk group.
So what kind of people are most at risk?
Well, little kids, under 5.
Okay.
Their immune systems are still figuring things out.
Right.
And older folks too, and anybody with a weaker immune system.
So if you're going through chemo or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you've had an organ transplant.
Makes sense. What about people with asthma or COPD?
Oh, yeah, they're definitely at higher risk too. Their lungs are already kind of sensitive, so any respiratory infection can hit them harder.
So what can you do to prevent it? Is there anything you can do?
Luckily, yeah. A lot of the stuff we learned from COVID, like washing your hands, avoiding sick people, disinfecting things, wearing a mask, that stuff all helps with HMPV too.
Oh, okay. So those habits actually kind of prepared us for this.
In a way, yeah. Being more aware of hygiene and stuff like that definitely helps.
But what about a vaccine? Is there a vaccine for this?
I wish there was, but unfortunately not yet.
Oh, man.
I know.
That's kind of a bummer.
Yeah. There's a lot of research going on trying to find a vaccine and better treatments, but for now it's mostly about managing the symptoms.
So fluids and rest?
Pretty much. Just like if you had a bad cold.
Well, that's kind of good in a way because at least we know how to deal with those things, right?
Right. But, for some people, especially the ones we talked about who are at higher risk, it can get serious enough to need to go to the hospital.
Oh, wow. Okay. So what would send somebody to the hospital?
If they were having a lot of trouble breathing, really struggling, or if their oxygen levels got too low.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's scary. So you really got to keep an eye on those high-risk folks, huh?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Catching it early can make a big difference.
So it sounds like it's spreading the same way COVID did, right? Those little droplets in the air.
Yep, exactly the same. Coughing, sneezing, talking, even just breathing can spread it.
And it can live on surfaces too, right?
Yeah, for a while.
Oh, man. This is starting to sound familiar.
Yeah, no, it's a lot like what we've been through with COVID.
So besides masks and hand washing, is there anything else we can do to stop it from spreading?
Well, remembering to cover your mouth when you cough or sneeze, that helps a lot.
Yeah, that's true. Basic stuff, but important.
Definitely. But even if we do everything right, sometimes people still get sick.
Right. So what happens if you don't take this seriously?
Well, for some people, it might just be like a bad cold. But for others, especially the high-risk folks, it can get really serious.
How serious are we talking?
Like pneumonia or bronchiolitis or even respiratory failure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And if a lot of people get sick at the same time, it can overload the hospitals, like what happened with COVID.
Right. It can become a whole big thing.
Yeah. So we're all in this together,
Yeah.
What we do affects everyone else.
So how do they test for this thing anyway?
Usually with a nasal swab, kind of like the COVID tests.
Oh, right. Does it take long to get the results?
Well, it depends on the lab and everything, but it's not always quick. And sometimes, the symptoms might be so mild that people don't even think to get tested.
So it could easily get missed.
Yeah, definitely. Especially if the doctor's not thinking about HMPV.
So what do they do if you do have it?
Right now, there's not much they can do to target the virus itself. So it's mostly about treating the symptoms, keeping you comfortable, hydrated, things like that.
Okay, so what's that look like? What do they do?
Rest, fluids, maybe some over-the-counter meds for fever or aches, that sort of thing.
Okay, so like the same stuff you do for a cold or the flu.
Exactly. But for the more severe cases, sometimes they need to go to the hospital, like we talked about.
What do they do at the hospital?
Well, they can give you oxygen if you're having trouble breathing and fluids through an IV, and they'll keep a close eye on you to make sure you're okay.
But is there anything being done to find, like, a real treatment, something that actually fights the virus itself?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of research going on. Scientists are working hard to develop antivirals.
Oh, cool.
And,
so how would those work?
well, they would basically stop the virus from replicating, from making more copies of itself.
Oh, okay. So it wouldn't be able to spread as much.
Exactly.
Are there any, like, promising ones in the works right now?
There are a few different approaches. Some of them are trying to block specific proteins that the virus needs to replicate. Others are trying to boost the body's own immune response to fight it off.
Wow, that's pretty cool. What about a vaccine? How's that coming along?
Vaccine research is definitely picking up steam. They're looking at different types of vaccines, including the new mRNA technology.
Oh, like the COVID vaccines.
Exactly.
Wow. So we might have an HMPV vaccine someday.
That's definitely the hope. It would be a game changer, especially for those high-risk groups we talked about.
Yeah, that would be huge. But I'm guessing it's not easy, right? I mean, viruses can mutate.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the big challenges. They're always changing, trying to outsmart us. And it's not just, staying the same. It mutates, making it harder to target with a vaccine.
So it's a moving target.
Exactly.
Oh, man. That makes things tougher. But they figured it out with COVID, so maybe they can with this too, right?
Yeah, there's definitely hope. And in the meantime, there's a lot we can do to protect ourselves.
Right, like all the stuff we talked about. But I gotta ask, like, what if we don't take this seriously? What's the worst that could happen?
Well, for some people, like I said, it might just be a mild illness.
Right.
But for others, it can lead to, more serious stuff.
Like what?
Pneumonia, bronchiolitis, even respiratory failure in some cases.
Oh, wow. That's not good.
No, it's not. And it's not just about individual people getting sick,
What do you mean?
Well, if enough people get sick at the same time, it can put a strain on the healthcare system.
Oh, right.
Just like we saw with COVID.
Yeah, nobody wants to go through that again.
Exactly. So it's important for all of us to do what we can to prevent it from spreading.
Okay, so we've talked about prevention, we talked about the risks. Let's talk about, like, what happens if you think you have it? What's the next step?
If you think you might have HMPV, the best thing to do is talk to your doctor.
Okay. And what will they do?
Well, they'll ask you about your symptoms and, examine you. And then they might decide to do a test, depending on your situation.
Okay. And if it comes back positive, then what?
Well, like we talked about earlier, there's no specific treatment for HMPV yet.
Right.
So it's really about managing the symptoms and making sure you're comfortable.
Okay. So lots of rest, fluids, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And sometimes, over-the-counter medications can help with things like fever and aches.
Right. So it's kind of like treating a cold or the flu?
Yeah, very similar. But in more serious cases, sometimes people need to go to the hospital, like we talked about before.
Right. What kind of treatment do they get at the hospital?
Well, they might need oxygen therapy if they're having trouble breathing.
Okay.
And they might get IV fluids to help with dehydration. And of course, they'll be closely monitored to make sure everything's okay.
Wow. It sounds like it can get pretty intense.
They can, yeah. Especially for those high-risk groups we talked about. But the good news is researchers are working hard to find better treatments.
That's good to hear. What are they working on?
One of the big areas of research is antiviral medications.
Antivirals, okay.
Yeah. These are drugs that can actually target the virus itself and stop it from replicating.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
It is. And it could be a game changer for treating HMPV.
So how close are we to having these antivirals?
Well, there are a few promising candidates in development, but it takes time to go through all the testing and trials to make sure they're safe and effective.
Right, of course.
So it's not going to happen overnight, but it's definitely something to be hopeful about.
Yeah, I hope they find something soon.
Me too. And you know what else would be amazing? A vaccine.
A vaccine? Yeah, that would be the ultimate solution.
Absolutely. And you know what?
What?
Researchers are working on that too.
Really?
Yeah, they're exploring all sorts of different approaches, including some really cutting-edge stuff.
Like what?
Well, they're looking at things like mRNA vaccines, which have been so successful with COVID-19.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
It is. And there are other promising approaches too, like inactivated vaccines and subunit vaccines.
So they're really covering all the bases.
They are, because a vaccine would be a game changer. It could prevent so much suffering, especially for those who are most vulnerable.
Yeah, that would be incredible. But developing a vaccine is a pretty big undertaking, right?
It is, yeah. It's not easy. It takes a lot of time, research, and resources, but the potential benefits are enormous.
Yeah, absolutely. So even though there are challenges, it sounds like there's a lot of hope for the future.
Oh, definitely. There's so much exciting research happening, and I'm really optimistic about what the future holds for HMPV prevention and treatment.
So all this research, are they finding anything, like any new stuff that could help us fight this thing?
They are, actually. There have been some really exciting discoveries lately.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, they've identified some key proteins in the virus that seem to be essential for it to replicate.
Oh.
So
yeah.
if they can develop drugs that target those proteins, it could be a big step forward in treatment.
Kind of like disrupting its plans.
Exactly. Stop it in its tracks.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So that's on the treatment side, but what about prevention? Any news on the vaccine front?
There is. There are actually several different vaccine candidates in various stages of development right now.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. Some of them are using more traditional approaches like inactivated vaccines.
Okay.
But others are exploring newer technologies like those mRNA vaccines that were so successful with COVID-19.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. So we could actually have an HMPV vaccine someday.
It's definitely a possibility,
Yeah.
and it would be a game changer, especially for those high-risk folks.
Yeah, for sure. So we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff today, but it sounds like there's a lot of hope for the future.
I think so, yeah. The research is moving in a really positive direction.
So what's the main thing you want people to take away from all this?
I think the most important thing is just awareness. You know, a lot of people have never even heard of HMPV, and that's part of the problem.
Right. If you don't know about it, you can't really protect yourself from it.
Exactly. So knowing about it, understanding how it spreads, that's the first step. And then, of course, taking those preventive measures we talked about, like hand washing and masking.
Yeah, that's good advice for pretty much any virus, right?
Absolutely. It's all about reducing the risk.
So what should people do if they think they might have HMPV?
The best thing to do is talk to your doctor. They can assess your symptoms and figure out if testing is needed.
And in the meantime, lots of rest and fluids, right?
Yep, the usual suspects.
Well, this has been a really interesting deep dive. Thanks for sharing all this info with us.
My pleasure. It's been great talking about this with you.
I learned a lot today, that's for sure. And I hope our listeners did too. So to everyone out there, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay curious. Thanks for joining us.